I'm Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center. A few years ago, learning about the forgotten meaning of the pursuit of happiness changed my life. When the founders wrote that famous phrase in the Declaration of Independence, they meant an ongoing commitment to self-improvement and lifelong learning. This discovery inspired me to write a book, and in my new podcast, I explore the founders' lives with the historians who know them best. Plus, filmmaker Ken Burns shares his daily practice of self-reflection. Join me for Pursuit, the Founder's Guide to Happiness.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 221 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Benjamin Franklin was born on January 17, 1706. And there are stories that circulate in Boston about just how cold it was on the day of Franklin's birth. One story relates that after his birth, his parents, Josiah and Abia Folger Franklin, dashed their newborn son across the street to be baptized in the Old South Meeting House, only to find that the water in the baptismal font was frozen solid. Now, given that colonial buildings like the Old South Meeting House didn't really have heaters in the early 18th century, it wouldn't surprise me if this fun story has a bit of truth to it. And while it may have been cold inside the Old South Meeting House in January 1706, it likely would have been a lot warmer across the street inside the Franklins' home. Josiah, Abia, and their children would have had to keep a fire going near continuously in their double hearth fireplace so that they could heat and cook meals for their household. Plus, Josiah would have had to have a fire going in another fireplace so that he could render the tallow he needed to produce soaps and candles for his chandlery business. And this brings us to the topic of today's exploration: the culinary tastes and habits of Benjamin Franklin and colonial British America. What did the Franklins and other British Americans cook in their double hearth fireplaces? And how would they have acquired and cooked the foods that they ate? These are just some of the questions our guest, Ray Catherine Amy, an award-winning food historian, author, and cook, will explore and answer with us with details from her book, Stirring the Pot with Benjamin Franklin, A Founding Father's Culinary Adventures. Plus, during our conversation, Ray will also address what historians study when they study food history, the colonial American kitchen, its tools and ingredients, and the eating habits and preferences of Benjamin Franklin. But first, just a reminder that I'm in Denver this week, and I'm really excited to meet up with you on Saturday, January 19 at 3:30 p.m. at Prost Brewing. I really hope you can make it because it's always a lot of fun to meet in person and to meet other listeners who share our interests. For more details about our meetup this Saturday in Denver, visit benfranklinsworld.com/meetup. All right, are you ready to commemorate Benjamin Franklin's birthday week by exploring the food and kitchens in his various households? Let's go meet our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Joining us is an award-winning food historian, author, and cook. Both the Minnesota and Iowa State Fairs have awarded her blue ribbons in their food competitions. Plus, she's the author of numerous books, including Abraham Lincoln in the Kitchen, and, most recently, Stirring the Pot with Benjamin Franklin, A Founding Father's Culinary Adventures. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Ray Catherine Amy.
Thanks, Liz. I'm delighted to be here.
So, Ray, you're a food historian, and I wonder if you would tell us about your work and what it means to study the history of food.
Sure. There are several ways to look at food and history. Some people study single ingredients over time. Other people look at long trends and see how things are explored. But I like to look at history with food. That is kind of connecting to people and events by considering the foods they ate and how they prepared them. You know, the forces or conditions or personal preferences that led to those choices. And sometimes we get lucky and have actual recipes that we can cook and see what people ate. We can come pretty close to it.
These recipes that we have from the past, are these the sources that food historians primarily rely on when they research food in the historical record?
Well, I sort of look broadly. I cast the net to see what I can catch. For some eras, Ben Franklin is one of those. There are cookbooks that are available, and we know some that he actually owned. So that's very useful. We don't have his wife Deborah's copies, so we don't have the battered pages, so we know exactly what she cooked. Franklin wrote about a little bit about food in Poor Richard's Almanac. Some people write about food in their diaries to give us a lead of a way to go. Sometimes there are newspaper articles, magazine articles in the 19th century. There are all those wonderful farm journals. So I just look as broadly as I can to see what I can find.
So as a food historian, how do your research projects come about? Do you start with an interest in a particular food, or do you start with an interest in a particular subject and then use food as a window onto that subject?
Yeah, it's food as attached to people and events. I see it as just this wonderful, to, be punny, tasteful way to approach history.
Now, you mentioned that sometimes historians have access to cookbooks from the period that they're studying. In fact, I believe you mentioned that you found cookbooks Benjamin Franklin, or at least his wife Deborah Reed, would have used. Is part of the work of a food historian to then recreate the food described in those recipes?
That's the force of what I do. In all of my work, I include recipes that I adapt from those primary sources so that they can be made in 21st century kitchens. And I try to get as close as I can to using techniques or ingredients without driving myself over the brink or my readers either. The idea is, for me, is to get as close as you can to the experience of those foods and try to understand more deeply the life of the person. We all eat, and most of us cook one way or another, even if it's just pouring milk over cereal. But I think you can bring a richness and a personal immediacy to your understanding of a historical figure or an era by actually enjoying, savoring the foods from those times or that they may have had on their table.
Okay, now let's turn to Benjamin Franklin and how we might use food to better understand his life. So we know that Franklin was born in Boston on January 17, 1706. Ray, I wonder if you would tell us about Franklin's childhood and about the foods you think he may have enjoyed and consumed in colonial Boston.
Sure. Franklin was born into a hardworking, working-class family. His father made candles for a living, and I think it's an enterprise in which the whole family was involved. And Franklin's father, Josiah, was also, a prominent member of the community. They've had people over, community leaders and church leaders, but you still get the sense, and reading the diary of Samuel Sewall, who is a noted judge in the Boston community and who was a member of the same church as Josiah, and they traveled kind of in the same circle. They interconnected in sort of a Venn diagram kind of way over matters of church. You can see from Sewall's words that the food, even in the richest families, was not all that fancy. So in Franklin's less rich family, you have a lot of cornmeal, you have dried peas, from which they made things like peas pudding, I'm suggesting. I think he ate a lot of fish. It was noted that it was one of his favorite foods. I think he ate a lot of apples as a child because it was certainly one of the favored foods throughout his life. So one thing that I found really intriguing as a way to kind of understand his family life was I looked at Josiah's record of the property from his estate, and they had listed 16 chafing dishes. Well, I have one. I have my mother-in-law's old one from the 1950s, and I thought, why on earth would you need 16 of them? Well, then I started reading in period sources and shortly after the period sources of, what people did with chafing dishes. And it was a way to have a convivial gathering with everyone having their own food in front of them, kept warm by the candle underneath the chafing dish. So in addition to using them to cook the way we did in the 1950s, people used them as a way to extend the social gathering.
You touched on this a bit when you mentioned Samuel Sewall's diary, but in case there's more to be had here, Emily would like to know how the variety in the food choices the Franklins would have had would have differed from the food choices a wealthier family like the Sewalls would have had, or from poorer families that would have surrounded them in Boston.
That's a really good question. And it's one to kind of hard to pin down because there aren't all that many sources that I could find that gave complete menus. Again, I resorted to Samuel Sewall, who was the judge and well off. And he's listing things in his root cellar and things that they kept by for the winter that are the same basic kinds of foods. I think richer people certainly had access to more expensive ingredients, more imported foods, things like raisins, for example, imported wines, which you don't see much sense of in Franklin's Boston home, but this is really pretty speculative.
Who would have prepared and served the food that Franklin ate? Melissa's really curious about the cooks who served Franklin over his lifetime. So who would have prepared the foods that Franklin ate as a child and then later as an adult?
Well, that would have been his mother or perhaps one of his older sisters. Franklin was one of 17 children, 50 of whom survived, and he was the next to the youngest. So when he was growing up, he had his mother who presumably did most of the cooking. As far as I could tell, the only hired help that the Franklin family had in Boston was the occasional indentured servant male who would have helped in candle factory. And he had, sisters who were 5 and 10 years older than he, who would have been around, who would have helped their mother. Once he married Deborah in Philadelphia, the sense of it is that she was a good cook and she did a lot of cooking. There were 3 women that we know of who helped in the Franklin's Philadelphia home. 2 of them appear to just be considered maids, not a cook. In the letters that Deborah wrote, there's a sense of them doing maid-type work, and in one letter, Franklin calls one specifically a maid. There were also enslaved people in the Franklin Philadelphia household over the course of their marriage. They had 7 enslaved persons working in the household. Only one of them was a woman. And again, it's hard to tell. We know her name. She was Jemima. She was married to a man named Peter. And it's hard to know whether she cooked or not. But again, my sense of it in the way that people talk about Deborah is that she bore the responsibility and seemed to enjoy the cooking. When Franklin went to London, he lived in the Stevenson household. Mrs. Stevenson and her daughter Polly did some of the cooking, but there was a household staff. And of course, when he was in Paris, there was the full staff, including cooks and the major domo kinds of people who did all the food ordering for this immense household that was, in fact, the de facto American embassy during the Revolutionary War. And then when he came home at the end of the Revolution, and he's living in what he came to build at the end of Deborah's life before the Revolutionary War, what they called the Mansion House, which he then enlarged when he returned after the Revolution. His daughter Sally's family was living in the household as well. And she would have assumed the responsibility for the cooking. And there were at least 10 people in that household, so it's hard to know whether she had kitchen staff or not. I suspect she did.
You mentioned many different women who played roles in Ben Franklin's culinary life. And I wonder, was cooking primarily the provenance of women in early America? And if so, what kinds of skills would a woman need to have learned to run and operate a kitchen in early America?
I think you're absolutely right. I think it was the prominence of women, certainly in colonial America, although I will say that Ben Franklin cooked for himself on occasion. He had a special pot when he lived in England for cooking chickens, which he used on top of his room heating stove. He frequently made his own breakfast hot cereal, again on top of the stove in a pot that we know that he had. So he dabbled a little bit in cooking as well. But basically, day-to-day cooking was done by women in the household. And, to us, well, to my eye, when I first encountered open hearth cooking, which is certainly what Franklin had in his childhood, was a large open hearth that was in the center of the house. And it was a 2-sided fireplace. So it had kind of a wall in the middle, a central chimney, and one side was larger, and that was the cooking half of the household. The other side was smaller, which would have been the living room side of the household, so to speak. And you think, well, this is really primitive. But the more I thought about it and the more I considered the sophistication of the tools that were available to colonial cooks, simple sophistication, you can accomplish a great deal of tasty cooking that isn't just all stuff put in pots that hang, or rest in spiders, which is frying pan with legs. There are devices in those, well-equipped colonial open hearth that allow you to adjust for temperature, cranes to swing things in and out, big large pots in and out, trammels which allow you to set the height of a pot above the fire. And if you've done it for any period of time, you know how to build a fire, a big one, a small one, just a little bit of embers, something more robust to cook a joint of meat that you would have turning on a spit. And there were a variety of mechanical kinds of spits. Franklin, in fact, invented one in Philadelphia that used the heat rising from the fire to turn the spit. So there are all of these, for lack of a better word, colonial conveniences to enable the homemaker to put forth a good meal.
Speaking of open hearth kitchens, I'm really curious because I've toured a fair number of colonial American homes, and in some regions, that kitchen stands completely outside the house, while in other places, that double hearth that you mentioned would have been found inside the house. So could you tell us anything about these different types of colonial kitchens and why there was this variation?
I'm not an expert on that kind of kitchen placement, but I do know that in Philadelphia, all of the homes in which Franklin lived, the kitchen was either an outbuilding or a separate connected room. I think it may have to do with economic conditions. If you're better off, you can, get all of that out of the room. And certainly in the South, where you have the heat of cooking not coexisting well with the wanting to live comfortably, you do see, external kitchens.
You've certainly given us a good description of colonial kitchens and all the equipment they contained. But what about their basic ingredients? Jay's particularly curious about the spices we would have found in colonial American kitchens, so could you tell us about the basic ingredients we would have found in them?
The spices are just really wonderful. You certainly would find cornmeal, which is, to Franklin's mind, the essential American grain, the grain that defined the nation. In fact, he used corn or maize as an example in a political diatribe in London near the beginning of the Revolutionary War, where he's saying, if you don't understand how corn is a vital, useful grain, because the British were deriding anyone who would eat it instead of having softer wheat, if you don't understand the benefits of this corn, then you can't understand the benefits and the essential importance of America. So you, in a sense, have no right to have us as a colony anymore. But, Franklin loved corn. He loved cornmeal. And it was something that he clearly had eaten all his life. I mentioned dried peas earlier, from which you would make peas pudding, which is certainly not a sweet dish. It's a dense, compacted, dried pea meal thing, which sounds absolutely ghastly, but it's really very good. You have smoked meats. You have, if you're in an urban setting, as in Boston, just go down to the wharf where they had the butchers set up and you could buy fresh meat you would want for a day. As to seasonings, you certainly have pepper and salt and some limited cayenne. I've seen that used in a few recipes. You have herbs like sage and parsley and thyme and tarragon. You've got your basic colonial spices, nutmeg and mace, which are the same thing. The nutmeg is the center part of it, and the mace is the outer husk, if you will. And both of those are grated or ground. Cloves, ginger, and you have seeds like anise and coriander and caraway. You have garlic, you have onions used for seasoning as well. And what you find is that the seasonings that we think of as being sweet seasonings, like ginger and mace and nutmeg, find their way into meat dishes. So it's a really interesting, different kind of flavor palette.
Now, how would colonial British Americans have acquired these spices and different ingredients? Jim's really curious about food acquisition and purchase.
It's an interesting question. I'm glad that Jim asked it, because colonial America is sort of this catchphrase, but there are, as we know, the different colonies, and there are different regions within the colonies. So if you look at Massachusetts, for example, and you look at Boston, the food from Boston came from the farms on the other side of the neck at Roxbury, from the farmers who brought in their produce and their meats and whatnot. It came from across the ocean, because Boston was a huge harbor town. But if you get further into the outskirts of Massachusetts, You have people growing their own food and being self-sufficient with very little opportunity for gaining those imported, if you will, ingredients. And you see the same thing in Philadelphia. Franklin and Deborah lived most of their lives in Philadelphia on Market Street, and it was, in fact, the street of the market. So 2 or 3 times a week, farmers from the outskirts of Philadelphia, from a little farther out in Pennsylvania, from across the river in New Jersey, would bring their variety of produce, meats, fish, which of course were not farmers, but from fishermen, to the market. So it was right there. As to whether people in urban settings had their own produce, grew their own gardens, there certainly is evidence that Deborah had been sent her seeds when he was in London, saying, these are for your garden. There's some suggestion that his mother, Abaya, had a garden at their Milk Street house, which was where they lived before they moved to Union and Hanover Street, which was a bigger house and a larger property. So there's a suggestion that she may have done, a kitchen garden as well, but we really don't know. As to whether either household kept fowl like chickens, I really don't know. Nobody has written about the chickens that Franklin might have kept, so I don't know the answer to that. And I don't think either one of them kept cows. I think in urban settings, there were cows kept on the common in Boston by a Boston cowherd person. And it's unclear as to whether those were individual people's cows that he sort of kept track of, or whether it was a community herd or a private enterprise. But I don't think the Franklins in any of their living situations kept a cow. Abraham Lincoln kept a cow, but I don't think the Franklins did.
So the Franklins would have purchased the meat and most of the fresh produce they would have needed for their meals at their local urban markets. But how would the Franklins and other families have preserved those foods and kept them fresh before they actually wanted to cook with them?
That's a really good question, and certainly one that's essential to health and safety. Because markets were, every other day, and people frequently had cellars in their homes, it wouldn't have been difficult to keep something a day or two. And in Boston, for example, while there wasn't a central market in Ben's boyhood, Fennel Hall was built after he leaves town, there were hucksters who would come through on a daily basis, walking the streets, selling their wares. So food is readily available, certainly when people can get out and about in the spring and summer and fall. But when you get to winter, there certainly aren't markets as easily and hucksters as easily. So people did preserve to get them through the winter times. And there's sort of basically 5 ways to preserve food. Things which keep well, such as dried meals and that sort of thing, just in a cask and put it in a cool, dry place, like in the attic, which is unheated. You can smoke meats. You can put vegetables down in the root cellar, vegetables that keep well in a root cellar. It's roots, obviously, things like carrots, onions, potatoes, parsnips, those sorts of common roots. You can dry things, such as herbs. You can pickle them using vinegar or make jams out of things. Or you can salt meat down, which is called pickling in the time, but it's not pickles like pickles. And so what the Franklin family would have done in Boston, the sense of it is, because there's a very funny anecdote where he's reported to have said to his very religious father, as they were putting casks of things down in the root cellar, Father, if we just prayed over this whole cask right now, we wouldn't have to say grace at every meal. So my sense of it is because it's described as a cask and it was described as going in, down in the root cellar, that it was probably some sort of preserved meat.
And what about the making of preserves? Fiona is interested in knowing more about jam making and other preservation techniques that I guess we would associate with canning and jarring today.
We know for certain that they made pickles. They made a lot of pickles. Pickles are cheap to make because vinegar is a relatively inexpensive ingredient. And you see people, talking about making pickles and preserving things that way. When you're looking at jams and jellies, that's a much more expensive process because, to make a jam, you need essentially equal weight of sugar to cooked fruit in order to get it to chill. So my sense of it is that while there may have been some, I don't think it was the primary preserving technique. I think people dried fruits, because you see a lot of, I'm talking about dried apples being around, and then you would reconstitute them. And if you wanted a sweet spread, you could, just make a small batch. And in the book, I've included a couple of small batch preserve recipes just to kind of get to that point.
Okay, so you've really taken us through the colonial British American kitchen. We now have a good idea of what they look like, the tools that we'd find in them, and the types of foods and ingredients colonial Americans would have prepared and cooked in them. So putting this all together now, if Franklin's mother, Abigail Folger Franklin, or his wife, Deborah Reed Franklin, wanted to have cooked Ben Franklin a meal, what would their process have been? What kinds of meals would they have cooked? When would they have cooked it? And when would they have served the meal?
That's another really good question. And I think it is much like we live today. It's how much time do you have? For example, either woman could have in the morning put together the ingredients for a stew or a soup, hung it on the trammel in the fire that they had already built, and it would be, like the colonial version of a crock pot. It would just sort of sit there and cook all day. But there certainly are recipes in the colonial era cookbooks that are quicker meals too, so that you could just kind of come in and, if you had walked up from the harbor and with a steak or a piece of meat and put your cast iron frying pan on the fire and toss the meat in and would be, ready in about the same amount of time as we cook today. It varies by what they would have been doing and what was available. There's not, I think, a simple answer to say, well, you have to cook all day over a hot hearth. There were ways around it, as we find ways around it today.
So Wes would really like to know when colonial Americans ate. Did colonial Americans eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner like we eat today?
They shifted, actually. You see, there's some kind of a breakfast meal, and I don't have a good time frame for that. But in a lot of the writing, and certainly Franklin wrote about it this way, the big main meal is late midday, so sometime between 2 and 3 o'clock. Then some households would have tea at 5 or 6, and then there would be a meal that was called supper that would come along a little bit later than that. I think there's some crossover between this tea concept and the supper concept. But Franklin, who urged moderation in all things, said a couple of times for Richard that people who ate 3 meals were setting themselves up to be unhealthy, and you should eat only 2 meals a day, meaning the breakfast meal and the larger midday dinner.
Now, a couple of times during our conversation, you mentioned Ben Franklin's father, Josiah, who worked as a chandler. And for a time, young Benjamin worked alongside Josiah, trying to learn that family trade. In Stirring the Pot with Benjamin Franklin, you have this really great description of the work a chandler like Josiah would have undertaken. So I wonder if, after we take a moment to talk about our episode sponsor, if you would tell us about chandlery, because it really seemed like there was a lot of cooking involved with that trade. This episode is brought to you by the Omohundro Institute, proud publishers of award-winning books since 1943. I don't know about you, but all this talk of food is making me a bit hungry. Did you know that Ray has included some recipes for early American dishes in her book, Stirring the Pot with Benjamin Franklin? Now, I know I'd love to try some of these recipes out, because some of the foods that fueled the Revolution and Benjamin Franklin sound pretty tasty. And when I think about the recipes in Ray's book, it occurs to me that it's pretty darned amazing what we can discover and do with the information we find in books. Speaking of which, over the last 75 years, the Omohundro Institute has published over 200 books, many of which are now classics in the field of early American history. You should really check out their full list of titles. They're amazing. And you can do this by visiting benfranklinsworld.com/OIbooks. And before we go back to our pending exploration of cooking for the chandlery business, I wanted to share something special with you. The Omohundro Institute is offering you a listener-only discount of 40% off any of their great titles. So when you're browsing their catalog over at benfranklinsworld.com/OIbooks, and you find the fascinating titles you want to read and add to your library, use promo code 01DAH40, and receive 40% off any of those titles. That's promo code 01DAH40. And don't worry, I placed the promo code and the details for this sale in the show notes and in your Ben Franklin's World app. Ray, let's talk chandlery. Would you tell us about the work and cooking a chandler like Josiah Franklin needed to undertake in order to make the soaps and candles he sold?
Josiah had 17 children, 7 with his first wife, Anne, who died, and then 10 with Abiah, who was Benjamin's mother. And Ben writes in his autobiography that from the time he was 10 and 12, he worked in the chandlery. And so I started to think, well, who else is there? Certainly, there are his mother and father. There's on and off an indentured servant. There's his next younger sister, Lydia, who would have been 10, and his next older sibling, Sarah, who would have been 19. There were 2 children in between Ben and Sarah who died. And you're right, it's a lot of cooking because tallow, which is the kind of candle that the Franklins made, is made from melted beef fat, a particular kind of fat called suet. So if anybody has bird feeders with that hard suet, that's the kind of fat that you use. And colonial cows had about 10 pounds per animal. I have a friend who raises free-range cattle, and so she helped me understand what that leaner kind of beef would provide as far as suet. So you have to melt that down and then skim off any impurities that would come along and filter it. And then you're ready to start pouring the candles or dipping the wicks to make candles. And my friend was nice enough to give me some tallow that she had rendered. So I was able to make these, not nearly as nice as the Franklin family candles, but I was able to see what they were like. And contrary to what I originally thought, there really isn't an odor. They have almost a slight sweet smell, but they don't smell like beef or steak or anything like that. But it took me about 3 hours to get enough layers on the dipping candles to get one that would have been about the size that the Franklin family made. It's essentially a day-long process, I think. In order to make it financially worthwhile, you have to melt a lot of beef suet into the tallow. I had envisioned, Ben and his father coming up from the butchery at the harbor with a wheelbarrow full of 75 pounds of suet to melt down, and that would yield them about 472 candles. And you have, one of the daughters cutting the wicks, perhaps. You have others of them helping to pour and dip, and you have to kind of straighten them during the first dippings because they want to curl up. Ben also talked about pouring the tallow into molds to make molded candles. And then there's the whole sales part of this. The family is spending all day keeping the tallow warm enough so that you can dip the candles in it or pour it out into molds. You have people coming to buy the candles. Ben talked about going and delivering candles to customers. You have Abiah and Sarah and Lydia also working in the kitchen to feed the family their evening meal. A process of interesting use of energy and communication and hanging these candles in pairs over racks so they could dry until you could dip them again. It's fascinating to think of the, if you will, assembly line part of the process and the communication that need to happen among the family members. And then at the end of the day, when they had finished their work, Ben talked about sitting around the table and his father bringing out the violin, and they would sing. And I got a sense from trying to build the narrative of that day, a sense of the family dynamic.
Yeah, this process really does give us a sense that the Franklin Chandlery really was a family-run business and that it really did involve everyone who lived in the house.
I think you're absolutely right.
Now, in discussing Josiah's chandlery, you mentioned that the Franklins bought a lot of cow parts. Did the fact that they relied on different animal parts for their business impact the way that they shop for food or the foods that they would have eaten?
I kind of like to think that it did, but I don't have any firm evidence one way or the other. But in building this narrative of the day, I decided I would write about Abiah using ox cheeks to make a stew, which is literally the cheek of the cow, which benefits by cooking all day long.
Now, Benjamin Franklin lived between January 1706 and April 1790, and during the course of his lifetime, he established the most successful printing business in colonial North America, conducted many different types of scientific experiments, invented different tools that made life easier, like bifocals and the Franklin stove, and he served abroad as a diplomat. Ray, Elizabeth would like to know how Franklin's eating habits and preferences changed over the course of his lifetime. And Theodore and Rick would like to know how Franklin's eating habits and preferences changed as he traveled outside of Boston and Philadelphia.
Those are really good questions. And it's hard to know, but my sense of it is, while Franklin moved from the simple food available to him in Boston into Philadelphia, where in his early years he was not very well off, and in fact chewed Deborah out when she bought a china bowl and silver spoon for him to eat his morning porridge out of because he thought it was spending extravagance that the family didn't need to make. As he moved up in social circles, as he traveled to London, where more and more interesting ingredients and foods were available to him, and then, of course, to Paris, my sense of it is when he occasionally says what he ate, he's still eating simple foods. He likes simply cooked beef. In fact, when he gets to Paris, he writes home to his daughter Sally saying that the food in France is much more healthful because it has less sauces on top of it. So he liked his food plain and simple. He liked his American grains. He loved corn. He liked his American food so much that Deborah sent things to him in London. She sent 5 different kinds of corn and corn flours. She sent apples, which were one of his favorite foods, in particular, a variety called the Newtown Pippin, which travels extremely well. It's what people call a good keeper. You can get it now. It's come into a resurgence, but he loved it so much that he had apple tree grafts sent to him in England so that he could send them to his friends in England. People sent him odd sure-tail relatives, cousins, second cousins, would send him chickens and turkeys from their farms. You get the sense that while the world and his wonderful ingredients were at his feet, he preferred simple, basic foods, although he did have a strong preference for Parmesan cheese. He liked it so much he wrote letters looking for a recipe so that he could make it or have it made for him. So he had an interest in what other foods were. His abiding curiosity propelled him to sample things. But I think as his daily diet, he liked simple foods.
If Deborah Franklin sent Benjamin a lot of different American foods while he was in London, did Benjamin ever reciprocate and send English and European foods to her in Philadelphia, or even back to his daughter Sally while he was serving in France as a diplomat?
He sent a lot of things back. He sent fancy clothing. He sent furniture. He sent a wonderful jug that he saw somewhere that he sent to Deborah. It was one of those jugs that has a character as its design. And he said it reminded him of her. He sent cheeses. At one point, he sent home enough cheese that he hoped that there would be some left when he got home a few months later. Well, unfortunately, he didn't get home until a few years later, and I'm sure by then the cheese was gone. But basically, he was the receiver of the food rather than the shipper of it.
Today, we understand that there are clear links between our diet and our health. And Leslie would like to know how Franklin's eating habits may have impacted his health, specifically his gout and kidney problems. While Ed is equally curious about whether Franklin's diet played any role in prolonging his life, given that Franklin lived into his mid-80s.
Those are really interesting questions. And I think it's kind of 2 ways to look at it. Franklin was concerned about health. He was concerned about healthy eating and healthy living. He urged moderation in all things. And that was kind of a lifelong habit, although he does occasionally talk about eating too much. But his sense of diet, no one really knew back then that by eating a high-protein, beef-based diet, which is a lot of what he ate when he was in London, makes your gout worse. And so they really didn't know. As to his bladder and kidney stones, he suggested that his were mediated somewhat by eating a tablespoon of blackberry jam every evening. And he sent that recommendation on to a friend who was similarly afflicted. As to, living a long life, I think moderation perhaps may have had a positive effect on that.
Benjamin Franklin was always curious, and he loved to experiment. As we know, his most famous experiments were with electricity. Ray, did Ben Franklin ever take his passion for experimentation into the kitchen?
Well, yes. At one point, he envisioned, he's writing to his friend, that wouldn't it be wonderful to have an electric party where we could have, electric lights, we could cook our meats with electricity, we could do all these wonderful things. His electric capability didn't quite reach that, but he did spend a fair amount of time one autumn trying to see how effective electricity would be in killing fowl. So he did a lot of experiments killing hens, and he knew how much electricity needed to have in these batteries that he had charged. They're called Leyden jars, and they look like a big glass vinegar bottle, and they have wires in them, and you turn them on a spit with a cloth against them to charge them, to fill them with electricity. And then you can rig several of them together to get more and more power. So, one or two batteries could easily kill a hen. So he decided he would advance to killing turkeys. So he rigged up a couple of jars and he put the turkey in between the contact points of the wires coming from these banks of Leyden jars. And the turkeys were just sort of stunned and came back to life. So he figured he would need more power. So he borrowed some Leyden jars from a friend, and he had a great many of them, maybe as many as 10, linked together. And foolishly, he stepped in between these fully charged jars and shocked himself so much that he was knocked unconscious and had a large bruise where the charge had touched his chest. But he was successful in killing turkeys with electricity, and he allowed birds killed that way ate exceptionally tender.
Now, at the end of each chapter in Stirring the Pot with Benjamin Franklin, Ray included several recipes. Ray, would you tell us about the recipes you included in your book and how you hope that readers like us might use those recipes to better learn about early American food, culinary traditions, and Benjamin Franklin?
Oh, sure. The recipes I've adapted from the period sources, and I've made them so that most people who know their way around a kitchen basically can handle cooking them. Some of them are more sophisticated, some of them are more basic, as kind of following, the arc of his life and his experience with available foods, as we've been discussing. The ones from Boston are really pretty simple. There's a peas pudding in there, which I had never made, but found a way to use the microwave to do it because, who wants to stand around for hours soaking these peas? And it's really a delightful counterpoint to any kind of a rich sausage. There's the whole world of bread and biscuits. There's an American biscuit and a sailor's biscuit, which are very different things. And it gets you a sense of what the bread was like back then and how sailors could take a bread, kind of like a biscotti is what this recipe is, that would be tasty and survive over sea journeys. I've had some in my cookie jar for months, and they're still good. There are, of course, apple tarts, which was something that Ben ate when he went on his vegetarian experiment when he worked for his brother in the print shop. His brother had said Ben's vegetarian diet was inconveniencing the cook who was preparing their meals. So he said he would give Ben the money that he paid the cook. Well, he only gave him half the money that he paid the cook for Ben's meals, and Ben could get his own food. So Ben would get his own vegetarian meals, typically a tart and a glass of water, and he would sit in the empty print shop over the dinner hour and eat his meal, have an hour of study time so he could read the extra books that were floating around the print shop, which, of course, is, one of the most important things to Franklin is gaining knowledge. And he only spent half the money that James gave him, so then he could buy his own books. So there's a simple apple tart that's good. As you get into London, I've paired two recipes there, one for hot roasted chicken that Ben would have cooked in this special pot on top of his stove, with a very rich chicken fricassee that the Penn family, who were perhaps some of his biggest bedevilers when he was trying to ensure that the American colonies could have a peaceful relationship and a successful relationship with London and the landowners in England. So there's a rich fricassee from them. And then there's some food from Paris that, there's asparagus and pea soup. Franklin loved asparagus. He, much to the shock of the French aristocracy, he ate it holding it with his fingers, which they thought was just terrible, terrible. But that was part of his presentation of a persona of an American rustic, which was how he knew he could succeed in getting the French to help fund the revolution. Had the French not paid for the arms, for the gunpowder, for even the soldiers, had they not sent their own soldiers, there's a real question as to whether the American Revolution could have succeeded. And Franklin was clever enough to, although he spoke French fluently, he didn't speak it as fluently as he was presenting himself to the French aristocracy. There's kind of talk about how he sort of fumbled around. And instead of wearing a wig, the way most of the other people wore, he wore this, rustic fur cap, presented himself as sort of doddering, all the while maintaining a very clever relationship to accomplish the goals of the emerging nation. And I have a menu from the party where they celebrated the signing of the two critical treaties between France and the emerging nation. So there's kind of a wide range of recipes, some little tea cakes when he comes back to America. There's a lemon ice cream from the Paris years. It's a combination of a rich, creamy ice cream and an icy gelato that's just amazing. And you make it without a churn because the mechanical churn wasn't invented until the middle of the next century. So a wide range of meats, vegetables, desserts, snacks, if you will, that give people, I hope, a good sense of the food Franklin enjoyed throughout his life and through the various places where he lived.
And now we should move into the time warp. This is the fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if Benjamin Franklin had not traveled abroad? If he had not traveled to London as a youth or later as an adult, and if he had not had the chance to serve in the United States abroad in Paris, how would his eating habits and tastes have been different?
That's a fascinating thing to consider. I think we need to kind of think about what Ben's essential nature was. He was dedicated to doing good. He was dedicated to public service. He had this incomparable intellectual curiosity. He loved to travel. Even when he was back in the United States or back in colonial America, he was traveling between Rhode Island and Virginia. He traveled, beyond Philadelphia into kind of the rustic hustings of eastern Pennsylvania. So I got to thinking about it, recognizing that you might ask this question. And I wondered what he would do with his time. He quit the successful printing business when he was about 40, and he walked away thinking he would spend his life doing scientific experiments and exploring electricity, hanging out with his scientific friends. So I wondered if maybe he would have spent more time with John Bartram, who is America's exploratory botanist. And Bartram, a fellow Philadelphian, traveled the length of colonial America from Canada to Florida, traveled into western Pennsylvania. I think he got that far west. Franklin certainly knew that there was this vast land out there. He knew it was the key to American success long term because people could keep moving forward. People could keep finding a life, finding their own success. Whereas in Europe and England, people were trapped. There was no more room. There was no place for people to go. You were set with the circumstances and your opportunity was limited. So America was this land of unlimited opportunity. So would he have gone west? Would he have explored perhaps even into Ohio? Certainly he thought about forming a consortium and started the work to do it. In 1767, he was working with others to buy 2,400,000 acres in Ohio for settlement purposes. It was land that was being released from the Native Americans through one of those strange treaty things, and we won't even discuss whether that was fair or not, but it was something that was on his mind. So would he have done that? Would he have then been happy eating venison, which we know he liked, eating the foods that Bartram discovered, the wild berries, the wild fruits, and then occasionally going back home to Deborah, bringing along samples of those wild vegetations for her to try in her garden? That's kind of the most different kind of thing I could think of.
So, Ray, you've cooked with Abraham Lincoln, so to speak, and you've stirred the pot with Benjamin Franklin. Which historical figure do you plan on cooking with next?
Well, I haven't quite settled on a new person, but I've settled on where I want to be in terms of the time frame. Starting with the time of Franklin, working through Lincoln got me to the middle of the 19th century. So I'm kind of looking for someone who can pick up, near the middle of the 19th century and take me into the 20th. And I have a few folks that I'm looking at, and I haven't quite settled.
Now, how can we contact you if we have lingering questions about Benjamin Franklin's diet or the culinary traditions of colonial British America?
There's a website which also has some of the recipes from the book, and it's kind of a bloggy website. It's BenjaminFranklinEntertains.com.
Ray, Catherine, Amy, thank you for helping us explore some of colonial America's food history and the culinary details of Benjamin Franklin's life.
It's been my pleasure, Liz. Thank you.
As Ray noted, food can provide us with a tasteful way to approach history. It can open a window for us onto past people and events. Ray believes that if we spend time trying to recreate and try dishes that people from the past like Benjamin Franklin ate, we can create and gain a kind of immediacy with them. And perhaps it's true. After all humans need to consume food to survive. And if we think about the power of taste, we realize that taste has the power to trigger memories and evoke emotion. These are really human experiences. So perhaps food can humanize the past. Regardless, we can use food as a way to learn more about the people who came before us. The act and tools of preparation tell us that early Americans were innovative and smart. They knew how to build good fires, how to adjust pots and pans so the food in them wouldn't overcook on the fire, and they knew how to plan quick meals for busy days and more elaborate meals for days when there was time. They also knew how to plan for the seasonality of food. Here in our 21st century, global transportation keeps our supermarkets pretty stocked with fresh fruits and vegetables all year round. But this type of year-round availability would have been foreign to those who lived in early America. Early Americans would have had to pay attention to the seasons. They would have known that apples, lettuces, and root vegetables came in during the late summer and early fall, that strawberries ripened in the summer, while other fruits and vegetables became available at other times of the year. The seasonal availability of food dictated the dishes early Americans prepared and cooked throughout the year. It also dictated a need to prepare for winter, when farm fields in many regions laid fallow, and the daily hustle and bustle of markets and hucksters slowed considerably. So, how did early Americans prepare for winter? How did they avoid a shortage of food? To compensate for the lack of fresh produce during winter, early Americans prepared. They stored flour and cornmeal in casks in their attics and other dry places. They smoked meats. They dried fruits, vegetables, and herbs. And they stored root vegetables in root cellars. They also would have used a lot of vinegar and salt to preserve certain kinds of foods, like fish and meat, and vegetables like cucumbers. Thinking about acquiring and preparing foods was an everyday act in early America, just like it's an everyday act for many of us. Now, in terms of the foods that Benjamin Franklin enjoyed, they seem to have been fairly simple. Apples, fish, cornmeal-based dishes, and if he could get his hands on it, Parmesan cheese. Look for more information about Ray, her book, Stirring the Pot with Benjamin Franklin, plus notes for what we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/221. Hello, Denver. We're meeting up this week on Saturday, January 19 at 3:30 at Prost Brewing. For more details about this meetup and RSVP, visit benfranklinsworld.com/meetup. Over the last 75 years, the Omohundro Institute has published over 200 books, and many of them are now classics in the field of early American history. You can check them out at benfranklinsworld.com/OIBooks. And when you find a title you wish to add to your library, use promo code 01DAH40 to receive 40% off. Finally, have you ever attempted to cook a meal from an old recipe? I'd love to know what you cooked, how it tasted, and whether it helped you think about the past differently. So drop me a line, liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.